Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Andy Marino and Craig DiLouie to discuss The Seven Visitations of Sidney Burgess, published by our friends at Red Hook. Andy Marino was born in upstate New York, spent half his life in New York City, and now lives in the Hudson Valley. He works as a freelance writer, and this is his first horror novel. To moderate tonight's conversation, we are also joined by Craig DiLouie, who is an acclaimed American-Canadian author of literary dark fantasy and other fiction. Formerly a magazine editor and advertising executive, he also works as a journalist and educator covering the North American lighting industry. Throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of The Seven Visitations of Sidney Burgess from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
And yes, I can answer questions on lighting if anybody. I always love that part of my bio.
I love that too. I have several.
So, Andy, it's great to connect with you. We talked for a few minutes beforehand to get all the technical stuff right, but we actually never met. We sort of met through our mutual editor extraordinaire, Bradley Engler at Hachette and Red Hook, who's just a fantastic guy and was able to connect us. I was able to read your book as a pre-publication to blurb it and absolutely loved it. So welcome to the chat.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. And you were my very first blurb, I believe, which blew my mind, and I really appreciated it. And yeah, we do share an editor, so if we want to, got any dirt on Bradley Engler, we want to spill later, we can do that. But I
There's
appreciate
no such thing with that guy, though. I mean, he really is a nice guy.
He's a straight arrow. I really appreciate the introduction. And like Craig said, my name's Andy Marino. The Seven Visitations of Sidney Burgess is my first horror novel for adults. My first novel for adults, really. So it's like a quasi debut. I've written a bunch of middle grade historicals for Scholastic and a few other publishers, but this is my first pivot into writing for adults.
I guess my first question would be, based on that, did you find it difficult to make the jump? Like a lot of authors, if they, like R.L. Stine, for example, wrote a lot of horror novels for kids, and then he wrote some horror novels for adults. I can't remember how he handled it, but some authors will do a pseudonym to jump markets like that. Did you consider that? Or
yeah, there were discussions about that, but it's really such a different, I mean, my books are like for middle grade readers, which is, 5th to 7th graders, and they're just historical adventures. And my newest one's about Chernobyl. So there's really just there's no chance that there's any kind of overlap between these audiences. Right. So I was fortunate enough to be able to just kind of publish in my own name. I think if I was writing horror novels for kids or even young adult novels for older teens, where there might be some crossover, like kids want to read up to an adult level, then I think there might have been, then a pseudonym may have made more sense. But just for these, I mean, there's little chance there's going to be any kind of real conflict.
Right. So I jumped to brass tacks, but I guess I should take a step back and just let you introduce your book. So can you tell us a little bit about the novel?
Sure. The Seven Visitations of Sidney Burgess is the story of a woman who is a recovering addict, working really, really hard to make a better life for herself and her son. She's got a new job, a house that she's paid for, really just scratching and clawing her way to all these positive changes. She's got a boyfriend who loves her despite all that's happened to her. And one night she comes home from work to interrupt a home invasion and is bashed over the head with a Jesus candle. And when she wakes up in the hospital and is interrogated by the cops, they're like, hey, why don't you tell us what happened? And so she describes the event, and they're like, well, the interesting thing here is that the guy who broke in was gruesomely murdered, like sliced up beyond recognition, and he's in your guest room, and you clearly did it. So it becomes this journey through her fragmented memories where she's trying to figure out exactly what happened that night. And so it's kind of hung on the bones of this modern thriller. But while she's investigating what happened to her, her old urges are rising again. And it becomes this kind of like both the visceral horror and the existential horror of relapse and addiction. And there are some body horror and cosmic elements too, towards the end when it kind of makes its full blown shift into horror. But I was really interested in kind of genre blending, in sort of hooking and having that real thriller, that kind of high concept thriller hook, and then slamming people headlong into horror.
Right. And did you, tackling a subject like this, what kind of experiences, did you have any personal experiences you drew on to write this?
I do. I mean, I think most people in the world, I mean, I had, personal experiences with people who are addicts, who are close to me. And through years and years of dealing with that, it just kind of, I think it occurred to me one day that cycle that I mentioned before, where it's like, for the rest of your life, relapse and addiction is part of it. Like there's no end. There's no cure. And that, to me, there was just this deep kind of, bone deep horror to it, where it's like, you can pull yourself out and you can make the greatest life on earth, but there's still, there's always this slippery slope back down to these horrors. And it's tragic for sure. And so I wanted to explore that in a very naturalistic way, but it was also such good kind of like foundation for horror. So I built the horror aspects of it on top of that. Yeah.
Now, were you reaching for metaphor, the whole idea of possession and addiction? Like, what was your thought process in connecting those concepts?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a really good question, because one of the things that was really important to me, and if you read the book, hopefully this comes across, I didn't want to ground this whole book in this metaphorical experience. Like, I wanted it to be visceral and true. So while there is this sort of like one-to-one possession addiction metaphor that is a through line, I didn't want there to be ambiguity in the end towards what's really happening. Is she just a crazy addict? It was very important for me not to write Sydney as this sort of like really tropey, unreliable narrator where it's like, what's really happening in her head? Is she hysterical and crazy? I really didn't want to mine that territory. I just wasn't interested in it. I wanted there to be specific things that were happening to her that she was fighting against. And so, yeah, there definitely is that level of it, but that layer was less important to me than having something tangible really come out. Not just like a metaphorical monster that's born of addiction, but like an actual monster. Right.
But they're thematically, they tie together nicely.
For sure. Yeah. I wanted to transcend the idea that you would finish the book and just be like, those were cool themes, but like, I really wanted there to be clarity and like, we're dealing with a monster in a horror novel here.
Right. But that kind of literary horror is really popular right now. You see it with some of Jordan Peele's work.
For sure.
You see it with movies like Relic, where what one thing will connect to the other, a haunting or possession or something like that. So it's a really nice fit, I think, that you found for your story.
Thank you. And actually, this is maybe getting ahead of ourselves, but when I was reading your book, The Children of Red Peak, which I will hold up here, one of the things that I thought was a really interesting parallel, one of the things that was important to me when I wrote about addiction, having kind of seen it up close and personal a lot, is like, I didn't want to use it, number one, as an easy signifier for weakness in a character. I wanted it to be much more multifaceted than that. And two, I wanted to show that it wasn't all this like grim doom and gloom, that like the reason people start doing this stuff is because it's fun. And there, even in like these really tragic situations where you're like, there are these weird moments of absurd joy as part and parcel of like the whole chaotic experience of being addicted to a substance. And there's there's a passage in your book, for anybody who doesn't know, it's a cult story, and there was a really similar moment where you talk about, and this actually just happens on the page a lot in your book. People don't join cults because they're these grim, knife wielding freaks from the get-go, right? Like, there's a lot of joy in that. Like, the kids are having fun in those cults, and their memories, even when they're adults, they're really conflicted. They're really messed up about what they went through, and they can still, academically, knowing all that, they can still look back on their experience in a cult and be like, those were some great times.
Yeah.
And I found that
best
to be
years
really,
of their lives, actually.
Yeah, exactly. I find that to be so much more interesting and true also about at least one part of being an addict. I really wanted to show that kind of thing because I think you'd probably agree with me. Like, it just makes it so much more three-dimensional when there's this, and tragic when it's like, no, that was really the best time of my life. And Sydney in my book too remembers these really reckless, I've been up for days and the house is trashed, but I've reached some transcendent fleeting moment, and it's horrible, but it's like you remember that fondly. And I really wanted to talk about that side of things because I thought that was just a well-rounded way to approach it.
Well, you brought us right into her head. There's a big difference with addiction, seeing it from the outside and seeing it from the inside.
Yeah, that was.
There's a big reward for them to be doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I always wanted it to be first person. It just made so much more sense. Just, I mean, there are a lot of challenges in that, but just having her being able to comment on things directly was really important for someone going through those things.
I think you were also really careful to differentiate the idea of that addiction is like a possession, but the addict is not like a possessed person necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. That's a good point. I've never really framed it like that before, but yeah, I think with like classic demonic possession, they're like, I think there's more. I'm trying to figure out how to put this. I think in like an addiction to possession metaphor, there are more things to explore and more outlets than there are in like possession could be anything, I guess, but in like a classic demonic possession where it's like this thing controls you now and makes you do things, and everybody doesn't know that you're possessed, and you're kill somebody and all that stuff. But I think with addiction especially, there's a level of self-awareness maybe that's not there when the demon takes you over. And that almost makes it more tragic, where it's like, I think there are moments in the book where Sydney knows exactly, she has an inkling of what's going on. She still can't stop what she's doing because she's taken so much of whatever. And so there's this kind of parallel moment of like, I'm being reckless. I know I shouldn't do this. I'm acting messed up in front of my child or something like that. And then
but there's a way to rationalize it.
Yeah.
Fix you with your own voice. That's the thing a lot of times.
Yeah, no, for sure. So yeah, that was really an interesting thing to play with in the novel, for sure, in terms of character.
Yeah. So, I want to talk to you a little bit about your process, but I kind of want to jump to the end because for me, this is such an exciting question to ask. I'm not going to wait on it anymore. How does it feel? You've been, you worked your butt off. Speaking from personal experience, I can tell everybody on this call that, writing is a lonely game. It's a labor-intensive game, and it's a labor of love. You pour your heart and soul into something, hoping it will translate into the reading experience, never really knowing what you're going to get. So there's this gigantic leap of faith involved. But then you see the book on the shelf of the bookstore, and you get to work with a great editor like Bradley at a fantastic brand like Hachette and these wonderful bookstores. How does it feel for you?
It's been a great experience. And even if we rewind, I mean, you hear horror stories for sure. And so I've been fortunate, but you mentioned that we share an editor, Bradley, at Orbit/Redhook. And from the get-go, working with Bradley was a really interesting and eye-opening experience because it wasn't just like he took the draft that he, ended up buying. It wasn't like he took the draft and just kind of went through and marked it up. It was serious editorial. Like, he had a vision and his
Yes.
vision extended to like something that I never there's like a whole sequence in the book that I never ever would have thought. First of all, I love the collaborative, like you said, it can be a lonely game. And I personally love the collaborative nature of writing. I like working with an agent. I like working with an editor and a team. And so working with someone like Bradley was really refreshing because he wasn't just like going through and line editing. He really did have these kind of left field idea that worked out in the book's favor immensely. And I was really happy with his editorial. So from that perspective, it was great. And then, yeah, from a publishing perspective too, again, you hear horror stories but I have been really happy with the whole team over there. So, and I swear I'm not just saying that. I would, but
no, they really are that good. I'm back.
Yeah, if they're watching right now.
You're lucky.
But yeah, no,
it's
it's Red Hook, which is an imprint of Orbit, and Orbit's been around so long and published some of the best sci-fi and fantasy ever, and they know what they're doing. They're passionate about the genre, and what's cool too is I think like besides Bradley, I don't think they have a lot of horror. I think like you and I and maybe a couple other like they're such a huge sci-fi fantasy publisher, and Red Hook now publishes thrillers. But I think there are kind of like a few of us sort of charting their horror path. So that's kind of a cool thing to be doing as well.
Yeah, I think Bradley is driving that bus.
Yeah, no, I think so too.
He's a huge horror movie hound.
Yeah. And it's great to work with somebody like that who's passionate about the genre, who's, whose experiences are different than mine. And so he brings something else to the table. And yeah, I can't, for me anyway, that aspect of collaboration has always been so important. And one, people always ask like, if you could give advice to writers, what would it be? And it's just like, mine is well, I always say like, be able to drop the ego and work with somebody and take feedback. And that's just going to make your life so much easier as a writer because, but yeah, Bradley's great.
Yeah. I had a similar experience. First of all, for me, the whole experience of being published for the first time with a major publisher was just a dream come true. I feel like I'm living a dream, and I feel really lucky. So that when I was 9 years old, I wanted to be a writer ever since.
Yeah.
And then, in the 90s, you're a younger guy than me, but like I've been around a little bit longer in the game, I think. And in the 90s, it was like being in a Kafka novel where you're invited to a party or not allowed to attend. Everyone's like, come be a writer. But then you had to get an agent to get published. You had to get published to get an agent. It was really hard. And then, and then one thing after another worked out, and it's a lot more democratized today. There's a lot more opportunity and then to build up your credits and and then eventually work your way up to a big publisher if that's what you want to do. But for me, that journey to be able to culminate with that, and now where I'm at now with Hachette has just been, like I said, absolutely, it's gratifying and humbling. There's no other way to describe it. Just a dream come true. But I had a similar experience with Bradley and Hachette in that the editing, I'm not so good with collaboration sometimes, maybe as you are. I get real fragile about it. I'm like, this is the best thing I've ever written. And then like,
don't touch a word.
Yeah. But also, like Nietzsche said, one sentence can change your whole world, right? Like somebody said the wrong thing about the book. I'd be like, oh God, you're right. I have to rewrite the entire thing. And next thing you know, I'm rewriting it 100 times because I'm a basket case like that. But what Bradley did, he would like handles me perfectly. He does that whole thing. And I believe you had the similar experience where he's like, this is good. I'm going to take it to the next level.
Yeah.
And so here's where I think it can go to the next level. What do you think? Can you get it there? And I'm like, yeah, I can.
Yes, sir.
I feel inspired,
Yeah.
And it's
great to feel that sense of team. Like we're on the same team here. Yeah. We're not adversarial. We're just trying to make it a better book. And I do think Bradley's really genuine about wanting to do that,
Yeah, totally. It's all about the book. It's not about egos or anything like that. So when you were writing this, and now that it's finished and in print, say I've never read it and I'm thinking about giving it a shot. Well, I have two questions here. First of all, I'm a little bit scared of horror, but I think I can handle it. Like, where do you see the ideal reader here? Like, would it be right for somebody like me, or is it somebody more hardcore horror, or somebody who likes thrillers but can handle a nice dark, something darker?
Yeah, I think. I mean, I'm going to say
All
this,
the
but I
above?
think it's right for everybody. But it's definitely, look. Its trajectory is this.
Yeah.
It starts with this really kind of like classic home invasion thriller, with no horrific elements besides just that's a horrific life experience.
Yeah.
And then as it kind of like, as her investigation sort of starts to circle this personal drain, the horror elements start jumping out at you. And so I think it's sort of like a soft landing for people who want to experience horror, but it's certainly a dark book.
And I think it's titillating to people. The reason why I'm asking this is I'm putting you on a spot a little bit, but I'm also asking this because a lot of people these are people who are friends of mine are like, oh, I can't read your book. That's scary.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, you're all right. You're my friend though. But but no, seriously, I'm like, okay, hey man, a person that horror is certainly not for everybody.
Yeah.
But reading your book, I think a lot of people would enjoy it. I think there is a really strong thriller aspect to it that drives it. The horror is sort of like this flavoring more than driving the plot. And I think there's a lot of psychological horror, which I think that anybody could enjoy. That the real horror is, I was this person, could I be that person again? Why was I that person? Are those reasons still there? What do I have? That whole idea of higher power breaking a dangerous circle, and is that higher power still holding, and so on.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the more horrific elements that I wanted to bring out, was like, can we ever really escape our true nature, and to try to bring that out in a way. But I think I didn't want it to make it like a genre stew, but I wanted to hang it, like I said, on the bones of a thriller, because I think that was a cool way to be propulsive and to drag people through the narrative. And it actually brings up what you just said. Reminded me, I was on a podcast a couple weeks ago, and someone asked me, is horror a genre, or is it something else? Is it like a mood? And how you were just describing the book reminded me of that, because I think I understand why bookstores need to shelve horror in horror, but I kind of do think, I think that I come down on the side of it being a sort of mood, and being able to kind of like weave in and out of almost any other genre. Like, you could have a sci-fi novel that's really horrific, like Event Horizon or something like that. And so,
or Alien, yeah.
What's that?
Or Alien. There's lots of movies.
Yeah, Alien's perfect example. But so I think I like looking at horror as something like that, where it's freeing in a way to think that like, I'm not, we're not constrained to like these horror tropes where like, even I would say, even in your book, The Children of Red Peak, like there's almost like kitchen sink drama. There's almost like characters like, really, it's like The Big Chill or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like that, but with horror.
The Big Chill meets an apocalyptic cult.
Yes. Yeah, it kind of is.
It's a good way
so I think that's what's cool about horror, is that it can come out. It can come out on the page. It can come out in a scene. And for me, just like turns of phrase can be really horrific, like, weird ways of writing, off kilter scenes, things like that. And so it doesn't have to be like, oh, it's a haunted house story from the beginning, I know it's horror. Like it can be like the books that you and I wrote, which, you might not read the first 10 pages and be like, yeah, this is definitely like a horror novel. But the horror is there. It's the mood.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there are works that are horror straight through. It's like all the way through the DNA. Yeah. And then there are other books that are stories that are, I think, something else, but have horror elements to it. And, honestly, those books that are X with horror elements I think they just tend to do better. They tend to draw more readers, simply because horror still has, I think, a little bit of a stigma to it. Like that, people don't like to be. Some people just don't like to be scared, right? They like to be scared in a safe way. They don't want to be taken to the edge. But I guess speaking, along those lines, do you think that the horror that breaks boundaries? Do you think that there's? I mean, your novels a little less on the hardcore edge. You're more, thriller with horror elements, say.
Yeah.
But you are writing in that space of horror. So from that perspective, looking at authors in the field, do you think it is possible to go too far, or?
Not really. I mean, I think when someone asks me what I'm doing, I would say writing a horror novel. But it is important to me to kind of not, just to be a little more free in the way I approach that. But yeah, in terms of like going too far, I mean, yeah, there are things that I choose not to write about. Is that what you're talking about, like content wise?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, there are definitely things. I mean, I don't think anything should be off limits for people who want to write about them credibly, but for me, there are certain things that I just will not write about. But I mean, most things are pretty much fair game. Whatever comes to me in the writing. But it's pretty interesting actually. Like there was a moment in an earlier draft of the 7 Visitations where Bradley was like, we don't really need this in here. And it is that kind of thing where you're like, oh, I'm really going to gross people out. And then, but you might do it right, or you might not, but like part of you, what you don't want to do is come across as like an edgy teenager. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, I'm going to shock him with this. Like,
yeah.
Cause that's just not going to work. That's going to come off the page and feel false. And there was a small moment like that in my earlier draft that Bradley, rightly was like, we don't need this. And so there is a line for sure. I mean, I'm not sure that in a global sense that there's the concept of going too far. Like, people write splatterpunk, they write pretty weird stuff, pretty out there stuff. But yeah, in terms of it fitting the narrative, if you suddenly go way off the deep end into like something horrible and disgusting and it doesn't really fit the vibe of the book, I think for sure that's where somebody like Bradley comes in, where it's like, it's not to say that you can't do this, but you really didn't pull it off here. So.
Yeah. I ran into that myself back in 2014. My first novel with a Big 5 publisher was published. That was Simon & Schuster, and the novel was Suffer the Children. And the novel was about a parasite that kills all the world's children and then brings them back from the grave with where they're inanimate, but if they're given a little bit of human blood, they reanimate for a short period of time before they become corpse-like again, and they need more blood, and then they need more blood, and then they need more blood. And the kids are vampires basically, but the monsters in the story are the parents who have to make a choice. How far will I go for my kids to keep them alive, even if it's just only for a short period longer? Well, I hit every taboo in that book you can think of.
Yeah.
But it did really well as horror. I really pulled the reins on the gross out stuff, but where it kind of counted with the core ideas.
I mean, that's a horrifying idea.
Yeah, I stuck to those guns, and it did pretty well as a result, but it's pretty dark stuff. With the Children of Red Peak, a lot of the gross out stuff sort of happens off screen inside the church. And so the it's left to the reader's imagination, and I just think that made it a lot juicier.
For that kind of book for sure, because the sense of the ominous, like what really happened here, and you've got your main character kid like hiding in the supply closet while horror, and then they come out and they just see blood in a church. It's just the
imagination's a powerful thing. Like when you read the books about how to write, which I do all the time, I'm constantly studying this stuff. But like one of the concepts I read that really resonated with me is to respect the white space, allow white space in your paragraphs. And that's where the reader fills things in themselves.
Yeah.
And if you trust the reader to meet you halfway and to join you in the envisioning of what's happening and how it feels and where it's going, and as long as they're empathizing with the character, it can be very powerful.
Yeah, that's a really good lesson, and something that I definitely needed to take to heart. Well, because when you write in first person, there's like what ends up on the cutting room floor and what doesn't. Like, I'm in someone's head, and I want this character to be like a totally immersive experience, in all her glory and tragedy and everything, so that the reader's right there with her. But that's like, how many things is she talking about and describing and remembering at once? Like, you could go sort of like, you certainly can't replicate like how the actual brain works, or that would just be gibberish. But like, it's got to be. You definitely have to have like a sense of what the cull from the herd of her thoughts and impressions.
That raises a really interesting point. What do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of first person as a writer?
I just love. I mean, I love like the first person present tense immediacy, and I think for a book, like I write pretty linearly, so I think I sat down. The first line is, "The man in my house is wearing a mask," and I think I just wrote that one day and just kind of started, and so it just sort of flowed from that. But the new book that I'm working on, that Orbit's publishing next year, is in third person, and so it jumps around a little more. So it, there's two different perspectives, but anyway, so it's all just sort of like it's all sort of what fits the book. And I think sometimes you get lucky. Like for Sydney Burgess, I wrote it in first person, and it just ended up staying that way. But you always hear stories about writers being like, I got 300 pages in, and then I changed it to second person.
Yeah, I've done that.
Yeah, so you've done that before. So you know, there can be this big shift when you're just like, this isn't working.
Sometimes I would use it to force myself into a deeper point of view.
Yeah.
So when you're writing first person, it does get you in that deeper point of view, but ultimately the book might not be served by first person. And so, or you have multiple characters. So you write it in first person and you flip it back. You might be surprised how much deep point of view is left over after that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I guess the corollary to that is like, if you want to strategically hide and release information, it can be a little gimmicky to do it in first person, because why isn't the person just telling you right now?
Right.
So it's like, so I think, like for me, I had a first person narrator, but her experiences were fragmented. So, and the structure of the novel was built that way. So I kind of got around it that way. But yeah, there is that issue of like, if I'm going to do this if I'm going to do this information release that's paced, accordingly, so that people find things out later and it's a satisfying narrative. If I have like an omniscient first person, why don't they just tell me it all right in front? Mm-hmm. So there is the disadvantage there, where it's like, it becomes that found footage gimmick. Like, how are they holding the camera this whole time?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I love that. So backing up a little bit, what drew you to horror to begin with? So, because you were writing the scholastic stuff, and then
excuse me.
Sure, I'm just wondering what the process was from. Well, first, yeah, two questions really. What drew you to horror, and then what really sparked? What was the first spark for that idea?
I always wanted to be a horror writer. I didn't know exactly what form that would take. I didn't know. I didn't have this. It didn't come fully formed that I wanted to sort of like work within the context of like a thriller and bring out these body horror elements. Like that came later. But I always wanted to. First of all, I always wanted to write for adults while I was writing middle grade novels, and horror was just a natural fit for me. Like I watch a ton of horror movies, and pretty well versed in the genre, and then just generally the weirder ends of fantasy and sci-fi and things like that. So it just seemed like a natural fit for me to sort of explore. And then, yeah, like I said, I really sat down and I wrote that first scene where Sydney comes home, and it's like almost like a cold open where you're in the middle of this action scene. just getting bonked over the head walking into her house, and then and it kind of just unfolded from there. I didn't have like a big scheme, a big story map or anything like that.
Okay.
It ended up being pretty linear. And
But
then
would you call yourself a pantser or a plotter? Do you kind of know where you're going, at least with the major plot points?
I would call myself a pantser, but one of the issues I enjoy writing more when I'm just kind of free to write a draft. But one of the issues I ran into, like Seven Visitations has a very clockworky structure. Each section has 6 chapters. They ping pong back and forth, and it's all very kind of like logically oriented. And so I had to impose that kind of rigor on the book, which wasn't a natural fit for me because I tend to be more freewheeling. But when you're writing a thriller, it has certain mechanics, and if you don't bring those out in the novel in some way, it's not going to be very satisfying. Like if things are just flying around and left unfinished and stuff. So for me, it was like that pantser experience of wanting to be freewheeling, but then also having to impose,
that structure,
real structure on it. Yeah. So it was an interesting experience. It was almost.
Was there a time you went, "Oh man, what I did"?
Yeah. What did I get myself into?
But you took it that far and you believed in it, I guess, and you.
Yeah. And I had one of my first readers. One of my first readers is a screenwriter. One of my best friends, and he is really good at like structure, things that I don't necessarily think about. And so, or think about when I'm just kind of writing off the bat, because he's used to like, studio notes. He's used to like ruthless, like, no, get that out of there.
Midpoint. Yeah. All that stuff.
So that was a big help, for sure. But yeah, it's an interesting, I don't know if anybody, I'm sure there are like pure pantsers, as they say, who just write all the way through. And I do tend to lean more towards that in terms of like enjoying the process more. But I can't imagine. I mean, these are books that have to have satisfying narrative elements, and I am, my goal is to have a writing career and write lots of books. So it's like I can't just sort of write anything and kind of sit back like no one touch a word of that.
Yeah, well, it's like they say, if you're going to break the rules, you should know what the rules are, at least, right?
Yeah, I totally.
And you break them strategically. You're making a choice for as an artistic direction.
Yeah. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with writing like really out there experimental fiction. Obviously, it's really cool to read and to kind of immerse yourself in and see what's out there. But like for me, that's not what I'm doing here. So it does require like an outline or some sense of what's going to happen. And Bradley.
Sorry. No, you got.
No, I was just going to say Bradley is a pretty big help with stuff like that too.
Yeah, what I was going to say was my own experience was I used to write a lot like you, and then as I found like more projects came along, and I had the same amount of time to do more projects. I found that the plotting was useful in terms of just being more efficient, and that was really the main advantage of it. And then, since then I've become more of a plotter because I started studying a lot more, the hero's journey and character arcs and plot structures and experimenting. And the more I experiment, I was like, I want to try that in a book. So the next book I would write, I'd be like, I think this book needs this that I've learned. And so I would try that. So it just worked better if I would plan it out. But I don't know if there is such a thing actually as a pure plotter, because you're just plotting the major points, and then you have this process of discovery in between, what they call discovery, which is really pantsing.
I read once that James Ellroy, who wrote LA Confidential, writes outlines that are as long as his books, which I thought was really hilarious. And I can't even really imagine how that works, but hey, I guess some people,
it's another way of saying he pantses it. I think.
Yeah. He just writes an outline that's real long.
Yeah. The late great Joe McKinney was like that too. A friend of mine who I know from my zombie days when I wrote zombie books, and that's how I got started in horror. and Joe wrote a bunch of books like that. But he would write like an 80-page outline.
Yeah.
Just, unreal.
It is unreal. And for me, I'm always like, I could just use this time writing.
Yeah.
It just seems like a lot of time to spend on an outline.
Yeah, I like to know where I'm going, but what I do is I carry a notebook in my back pocket, and I have another notebook around the house, and I'm constantly taking notes, and I'm constantly dreaming and thinking about the book, almost where I just lose myself in it. And all those still moments of the day, you're in the shower or you're driving in your car, or the worst one is when I'm trying to fall asleep and all these great ideas pop into the head, and you start scribbling them down. So I'll fill up these like notebooks before I even write chapter one. Do you have
I remember for every. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask you, do you have a process that relates to that in any way? Do you take a lot of notes first? Do you do research, that kind of thing?
It's what you were saying just then reminded me of every office job I've ever had. I would go home every day with like Post-it notes stuffed in my pockets of like, when I was bored during the day of ideas. No, for Seven Visitations and the new horror novel that I'm just finishing up now too, it's all just kind of in one spot on my computer. I don't really have a lot of notes running at the same time. But interestingly enough, the middle grade novels that I write are historicals. So like I wrote a World War II trilogy for kids, and I wrote a Chernobyl novel for kids. And those have like long running research things that I have to, because I have to set it credibly in this framework of,
right.
Ukraine in 1986 or Berlin in 1945 or whatever. So those actually tend to be a lot more research heavy, even though they're, short 40,000 word novels for 10-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, for stuff like for stuff like the horror novel, at least, I didn't have to do a lot of research. The newer one is about art, so there's more research involved, but it tended to just be like not a lot of like, it wasn't like a stack of tomes or anything like that. It was like looking stuff up. But
the guy goes to the library, and I come home like this. I've written World War II fiction, so I like basically learned how to drive a Sherman tank and
that's awesome.
Drive a submarine. I go all out with it.
I got for my for the last novel I wrote that's out now at the book fairs at Scholastic called Escape from Chernobyl. I actually found a book from 1989 about just modern life, everyday life in the Soviet Union, and it was written right before the Iron Curtain just kind of ended, and so it had everything like which bands were forbidden, which kids couldn't listen to, like you can't listen to the Talking Heads in Russia. But it was this is just an anecdote really, but the book had all these moments where it would be like extrapolating what the Soviet Union was going to be like in the year 2000 or like the year 2010. It was really, really interesting because it was like they had no idea it was about to just come to an end.
Yeah.
I love stuff like that.
Yeah, that's good. That book was a goldmine for you, probably.
Yeah, I actually really do value. I love like the minutia of research, like what people were eating and stuff like that. In addition to the macro stuff, but it hasn't really applied to the horror work I've been doing, just because that stuff's been like a little more immediate, kind of off the top of my head.
Yeah, gotcha. I just find it wonderful fodder. Like when I wrote The Children of Red Peak, like you were pointing out before we started the this presentation, that some of the musical scenes were accurate, and even though I'm not musically proficient, and I just that's all the product of research. And the same thing with I wanted to like really understand the mindset of somebody in a cult, why they do it, what it's like to leave, what it's which is kind of like an addiction in itself.
Yeah.
They say that you can leave the cult, but the cult never really leaves you. So, but I just love to talk to other. Sorry everybody if you're watch this. Writers can talk shop all day long, but I just fun to like get in your head and see what your process is, and how you come up with your ideas and your stories.
What Craig is referring to really quickly is when we were in the green room before the presentation started, I was asking him. There are elements in his book that one of the characters is in a band, and there's he comes across as by he I mean Craig comes across as such a music gear nerd because there's this like so many things about the guitar player's pedal board and like the effects and stuff like that. And I was like, "Do you play music, man?" Because I was impressed with the quality of the realistic nature of the guitar playing in the book.
Well, we're about 45 minutes past the hour by my clock. So
should we take questions?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I wanted to say that really flew by. So thanks for a wonderful conversation, Andy.
Yeah, seriously.
And thank you, all of you, for joining us. And before we open it up for questions, I have one more for Andy, which is what are you working on now? You kind of alluded to it, but I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit more.
Sure. I have a horror novel coming out about a year from now, also with Orbit Red Hook, and it's about a sculptor whose sister gets kidnapped, and he's forced to make this impossible sculpture to secure her release, and then the sculpture kind of triggers. It's basically this infernal thing that triggers all this stuff happening in the town, but it's like another kind of ticking clock novel where there's this crime, and that is the basis for all these horrifying things.
Awesome.
And it's a lot. It's about art. His sister's a painter, and so that'll come out next year. It does not have a title yet.
Well, it sounds great.
All right, so we're gonna get into some questions, and it looks like we have 5. Again, if anyone wants to ask a question, you can pop in a question on the Ask a Question feature. But let's get started. So the first question is, who are your favorite horror authors? And this could be for both of you.
Great question. Like I was mentioning before, I tend to like the weirder end of horror. So I like some of my favorites are Kathy Koja, who wrote this book called The Cipher back in the 90s, which is just a great, gritty novel about a hole in the ground.
Yeah.
It's really cool. It's one of my favorites. It has a big influence on me. I like some short story writers that are kicking around now. There's a guy named Brian Evanson that I really like. He wrote a collection called The Collapse of Horses that I return to again and again. It's kind of that horror that I was talking about before, where it's just like a turn of phrase that sticks in your head. And like Craig and I were mentioning, I like stuff that like Jeff Vandermeer, like Annihilation, sci-fi stuff that kind of veers into this weird horror. So I tend to love stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I like some of those same authors. I enjoyed The Cipher. I thought it was off the hook, actually. And
crazy.
Yeah, and I like kind of a range. There's some really dark and moody stuff by authors like Adam Neville. I like Stephen Graham Jones for his gritty, the psychologically gritty nature of what he writes. And then there's people like John Skip who fully understands that horror and comedy are kissing cousins, and his stuff is pretty gonzo. So I don't know. I have tons of favorite horror authors, but I kind of like each one for a different thing.
Yeah.
And I learn from all of them. They're all teaching me something every time I read one of their books.
Yeah, I just read, speaking of Stephen Graham Jones, I just read The Only Good Indian. It was really cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Our next question is, what was the most exciting part of writing this novel / writing in the horror genre?
Good question. I mean, the most exciting part was getting to work with Bradley and getting to be published by Orbit, just on a professional level. But the most exciting part creatively was definitely when I hit on the structure of the novel is divided up into visitation sections, and each section has 6 chapters that ping pong back and forth in time. So like I said, it's pretty rigid, and hitting on that as like it was one of those just like ding moments where it's like, this is how the book is going to be organized. that comes around maybe once every draft or something like that when you write. And that was a really exciting creative moment for me.
I'd say for me, on every novel, the most exciting part is, besides the obvious, like you're seeing it in your hand, it comes out right out of the box from the publisher, and you're like, wow, this is real.
Yeah.
There's that point, and Andy, I bet you can relate to this. There's that point where you're, when you write a novel, it's almost like climbing Mount Everest. So you set up your base camp, and then you walk, and then you look up, and you're like, that's the farthest thing I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
And then you just take a step and another step and another step and another step, and then you turn around and you're like, well, I came a really far way. And then you hit this point in the creative process where you top the peak, and you're looking down the other side, and it's just starting to go over almost like a roller coaster. And then you just, for me, I can't write fast enough to keep up once I'm there. And it just feels so good. Everything's clicking, everything's firing. And it feels so good that when it's over, I actually get novel hangover, where I'm like, I'm like, I just feel terrible, like for a couple days afterwards, because it's over, the party's over.
Yeah, actually, I've had that experience too, where it's like you think that the minute you write the last word in the draft is going to be this great, like, relaxing moment, and I never feel all that good.
Yeah.
Okay. Our next question is, do you have a special ritual when writing?
That's a good question. I think I used to be a lot more precious about, like, getting up at the crack of dawn and having like certain really quiet time and having an hour, stretches of hours. But I think I've learned to be, as I've gotten older and there are just more obligations in life, I've learned to be less like that and more just like, I have time to write now, I should write. So I any kind of ritualistic element, I think, has been replaced by just like time, the natural time constraints of being a human being. And like when I was in my early 20s and just starting out writing really horrible practice novels, I could, come home from work and make a pot of coffee and just sit there all night and write. And it's not so much like that anymore. It's more like, let's fit it in now. But yeah, no, I don't have like special, like candles or anything.
I remember those late nights of excitement, catatonia myself, staring at a screen, like just, all the endorphins flying. Yeah. For me, no special rituals. I'm the most boring writer in the world. I sit in front of a screen like this. Everything has to be dead quiet. No music. I'm not Stephen King, likes to listen to metal or something. And I'd love to be that guy. I'm just this really quiet. Everything's got to be quiet. I'm just doing this for hours at a time. But in my head, all hell is breaking loose, I assure you. But it on the outside, watching it happen is actually pretty boring. There was no.
Yeah, I'm the same way. It's got to be dead quiet. It's not a very cinematic experience.
Yeah.
Not like.
Yeah, exactly. That would be cool, wouldn't it?
Okay. Our next question is, this is directed towards both of you again, and it's, is it hard to write horror elements?
Yes. Here for me, that's a really good question. And this is why it's hard for me. I'm trying to get this straight in my head. If you sit down, other people may just this may just flow for people in a different way than it does for me, and that's cool. But for me, if I sit down and I say, this is a horror novel, this scene had better be scary. I better scare people with this scene. It's going to be the flattest, unscariest thing. Like, as far as I know, it's impossible to sit there and be like, this is going to be scary. This is going to be scary. I'm going to scare people. Like, it just doesn't happen that way. And that was a big challenge for me to kind of learn how things developed and how things paid off and what was really scary. And, and it wasn't just like, you could sit there and be like, they walk into a dark house, there's a ghost behind the door, and it's like, that's not very scary. So yes, that stuff is a real challenge because the stuff you think is scary, if you've watched a lot of horror movies, doesn't always translate to the page. It's a whole different thing. So, you can't just be like, it jumped out, but it was just a cat. So all those things that you kind of like think in your head, like that's gonna be pretty scary. When you actually sit down at the blank page, it's not scary at all. So for me, sitting there and thinking I'm gonna write something scary is counterproductive, and that is the biggest challenge for me.
I think that horror is challenging to write but so rewarding to write. Like horror gets you. Gives you so many opportunities. It's sort of like the dark version of sci-fi and fantasy, where you can take ordinary people and really put them in extraordinary circumstances and test them, where you can strip their humanity right to the bone and find out what they're really made of. That's really psychologically fascinating, both as a reader and as a writer. But it can be challenging because like Andy said, it's a lot of times it's finding that what he was saying, but also finding that balance. Like, am I laying this on too thick? Not just am I making this scary enough, but am I actually laying on too thick and exhausting the reader? Another thing that I learned that I think is really important here, when you're going to write horror, you really need to study and understand character. And this is one of the things I think Andy gets dead on right with his book, is you're in Sydney's head and you really care about her and what happens to her and her kid. And so that is the absolute essence. A character walks into a house, a ghost jumps out, boo. That's actually not scary. It might be titillating, but it's not scary. But if you're in that character's head, and that character hears noises that they can't explain, and they're afraid of the dark, and the lights go out, and they're terrified, you're going to be terrified with them.
Yeah.
If you've done a good job with the character. So for me, the biggest challenge of horror isn't so much writing the horror element, it's making sure your character arc and your characterization is strong enough that horror element will carry through and be visceral and powerful. And then the only other thing I would add about there is that's challenging with writing horror is the tropes are done and done and done. So you really should try and find a fresh way to do it, which Andy, I think, accomplished nicely.
All right. And this is our last question of the night. So it is, do either of you have a favorite horror book to film adaptation?
Ooh, that's a really good question.
I mean, one comes to mind for me right away, which is I really enjoyed The Ritual, Adam Neville.
Oh yeah.
But I know that I'm missing one I want to praise to the rafters. I liked it. I actually loved it, but I don't know if that is my favorite. Do comes to mind for you?
Well, like I said before, this is more sci-fi horror, but I really liked Annihilation, and I liked the book a lot, and I liked how Alex Garland kind of envisioned the twisty version of it in film. I thought it's got some really it's a good example of horror being more of a mood, but there's some really freaky stuff that are just purely cinematic, and I really like that.
I'd agree with that. That was a good adaptation.
But The Ritual is a good call. Yeah. I also really like The Shining a lot. I know Stephen King doesn't, but
yeah. Well, we could do Stephen King for a while. Actually, the Darabont's The Mist, quite a bit.
The Mist is awesome. Yeah.
The Darabont movie, not the TV show.
Right. Yeah.
He did a great job with Walking Dead too, which is another adaptation.
Yeah.
From a comic book.
Yeah, I forgot about The Mist. That's a good call.
This is a terrible question to end on, because we could. How much time do you guys have?
Yeah.
You can answer a few more, whatever.
I'll stop there.
Fair enough. All right. Well, we're cutting close to the end here, and just wanted to say thank you to both Andy and Craig for this amazing event tonight. It was so fun to watch, and so fun to listen. And I personally feel like I learned so much about horror and writing horror. I've never been a big horror buff, but now I'm curious to read some. So who knows?
Got to convert.
Yes.
That's
So
great. Thank you for having us.
yeah, thank you
for
both.
having us.
Thank you to everyone who joined and watched us tonight. And don't forget that you can order your copy of The 7 Visitations of Sydney Burgess from our website or in store. And don't forget to support your small indie bookstores. It's so important. And yeah, thank you all. Thank you so much for tonight.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.